Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm going to be commentating over another pre-recorded match that I played against a user by the name of kwarrend, which was played for the third round of the fourth season of Sam Mann's Warhammer 40k Conquest OCTGN League. Though at this point in my LCG career, I've created an enormous number of videos and interviewed what feels like innumerable tournament champions, my personal estimate for total number of matches played is still somewhere underneath 20. So, while I frequently have the opportunity to talk to the experts and feel like I have a rather reasonable potential, I'm still missing an underlying understanding of a great many basic and fundamental elements of gameplay that would still stand to make me a much more competent player. So, I definitely make more than my fair share of mistakes and suboptimal plays throughout the course of this video, and for that reason I ask that you please leave comments constructively criticizing and providing feedback for how I could improve, because with your assistance, hopefully someday, I can indeed reach the level of skill and experience required to become a truly formidable, competent tournament player. So, if you enjoy this video and would like to see me play out and commentate more matches of my own, be sure to let me know in a comment. But in any case, let's get this video started with a match between myself as Ragnar Blackmane and kwarrend as Old One-Eye. Alright, welcome to yet another commentated OCTGN match. This is going to be my third week match for Sam Mann's Warhammer 40k Conquest OCTGN Competitive Online League. My opponent this week is going to be kwarrend playing the Tyranids Warlord Old One-Eye. Once again, I've taken up the reins of our Space Marines Warlord Ragnar Blackmane. I don't see myself as a very competent player as of yet, so I'm trying to rely on a fairly well-performing competitive warlord to try to pick up a bit of the slack. A lot of players happen to consider the Space Marines relatively straightforward and simple to play, so I'm kind of hedging my bets, giving myself a little bit of an edge to try to make up some power differential prior to my becoming a genuinely skillful player. In taking a look at my opening hand, I do not decide to take a mulligan. What I was kind of relying on is some decent command units and things like Blackmane's Hunt. In taking a look at our planet layout, planet number 1 is going to be Planum. I was thinking I could potentially put out my Blood Angels Veterans at that planet. My opponent happens to have initiative, but I would be able to take some punishment. Thanks to the Blood Angels Veterans ability, that reaction helps prevent some damage, so it's a nice buffer against my opponent's Synapse unit, his Blazing Zoanthrope, and because I happen to start the game with 2 copies of Blackmane's Hunt, I thought that was a nice opportunity for me to send Ragnar to any planet but number 1, and then have the threat range of bouncing him to planet number 1 if need be to trigger Ragnar's 2 points of damage ability and also to dish out some damage to the enemy warlord. The initiative token happens to be in the hands of our Tyranid player, and we happen to see the signature support, the Awakening Cavern, as his first action, and as I mentioned earlier, the Blood Angels Veterans is going to be my first action. So our Tyranid player is already afforded the option of being able to at will ready any single Tyranid unit on the battlefield. So it could be his warlord, it could be an elite army unit, it could be a synapse unit, or it could be a token. We see my opponent put into play a Scything Hormagaunts at planet number 1, and that's automatically going to infest that planet. In taking a look at our planet layout in general terms, we could see a victory as early as planet number 3, and seeing as how I was thinking about doing this Planum shift of my Blood Angels Veterans from planet 1 to planet 2, I was thinking I could try to play as aggressive as possible, and just because I don't have a tremendous number of command icon heavy units in my hand, I was still relying on that fact that my Blood Angels Veterans would be able to kind of facilitate that hyper-aggressive playstyle. As is shortly to become abundantly clear, I did happen to make the mistake in this video that thinking Blackmane's Hunt happened to work just like Eldorath Starbane's signature event, Foresight, where you can bounce from one planet to any other planet, but Blackmane's Hunt has to specify adjacent planets. So kind of a mistake I make early on is, thinking that I've got Foresight in my hand as opposed to Blackmane's Hunt. I end up putting out a copy of Tactical Squad Cardenas to planet number 2, thinking that if I happen to see a large number of Tyranids, and again, I'm trying to be hyper-aggressive by playing my units as far in advance as possible, I'll have the initiative token at that planet. Something that's particularly nasty here is this Scything Hormagaunts all of a sudden has 3 attack and 3 hit points since it happens to be at an infested planet with a noxious flesh borer that happened to be my opponent's action during his third deploy action. All of a sudden he can hit my Blood Angels veterans, and I'm probably not entirely aware of it at the time. I tend to realize things all too late due to my inexperience as a player, but that Awakening Cavern can allow him very conveniently to kill off my Blood Angels veterans. But once again, I'm kind of thinking conceptually about having Ragnar exhibit this wide threat range so that if need be, I can bounce to the first planet, I can potentially hurt his Warlord, I could potentially hurt his Synapse unit, all kinds of different things, and just yet another very aggressive move on my part instead of putting out a command unit to try and generate additional cards and resources. And be sure to let me know in the comments if you agree with this or disagree. I put out a Catachan outpost just so that if I do get an opportunity to swing at any point, I can hopefully destroy anything the Tyranid player can bring to bear. And unless he happens to have a 3 shield icon card in his hand, the Great Scything Talons, my Blood Angels veterans would have been able to kill his Scything Hormagaunts with their flesh borer in a single swing. But of course, I happen to space the fact that he has that oh-so-convenient, powerful Awakening Cavern right there. And at this point, my opponent basically has free reign in regard to where exactly they'd like to deploy their units. I don't recall exactly where he sends his forces, but there's myriad planets open for him to try to grab. I happen to mention that planet number 1 is Planum, planet number 2 is going to be Yvarn, and 3 is going to be Ossus 4, which allows for stealing of resources. We see my opponent's Warlord go to planet number 5, which is going to allow him to rout one of my units, which definitely would have thrown a wrench in my Blood Angels veterans plan. We see the Blazing Zoanthrope go to planet number 1 to take full advantage of that infestation token, but whether or not this was kind of a mistake or not on my opponent's part, I'm not sure. It does allow him to trump command at planet number 1, but he's definitely got plenty of firepower to try to knock out my Blood Angels veterans, so he manages to deprive me of quite a bit of command. I'm going to end up winning 2 resources, so that would have been enough for a drop pod assault or something like that, so I'm sure he probably doesn't know what to expect from me in regard to eager recruits or anything like that. I sent Ragnar to Taurus just in case I end up having a lower unit total than he does, just because that planet number 4 there is going to be able to generate a ton of additional cards or resources for me, potentially, especially considering that the Tyranid player happened to start off with an additional Synapse unit relative to what I started the game with. So I wanted to pin that down pretty much under any and all circumstances. I was just very much relying on these Blackmane's hunts to be able to bounce me to planet 1 if need be. And in regard to winning command, kind of a theme throughout the course of this game, as you will see, is I don't necessarily manage to establish myself very well just because I'm trying to stick to a hyper-aggressive playstyle. But planet number 1 is Planum, planet number 2 is Yvarn, which puts units into play, planet 3 is Ossus 4, which steals resources. Planet 4 is Taurus, which confers cards or resources based on unit count, and then Planet 5 is Farron. So the battle at Planet 1 is currently taking place. There's no actions on part of either player. At the beginning of the combat phase, my Blood Angels veterans ends up taking 1 total damage from that Blazing Zoanthrope's 2 damage warp blast. and my opponent has the initiative token. I've at this point realized he's got the Awakening Cavern. I've got some shields in my hand, but they're definitely not really too worth playing if he's attacking for 3, and I'm going to essentially just be destroyed no matter what, since that Awakening Cavern is going to be able to ready his forces, and he has that Zoanthrope, so I suppose I could have thrown out one of these Blackmane's hunts. Well, actually, I couldn't. So no matter what, I'd have died there. I'd have hit 0 HP, so I didn't have the opportunity to potentially swing at his Zoanthrope for 5. That would have been absolutely fantastic. I'd have loved to kill that. I'd have loved to kill the Scything Hormigaunt, but of course, I didn't have a Drop Pod Assault, I didn't have a Primal Howl, none of those convenient 2 shield icon cards, and of course, no Indomitable, no Frostfang, none of that. So at this point, I've realized that I've lost the first planet, and then in kind of reassessing my victory condition, I know that if I can take the next 3 planets, I can still win, or if I can take our soon-to-be Planet 2, or our current Planet 2, soon-to-be Planet 1, if I can take Yvonne, if I can take Taurus, if I could take Farron, I could also win there. Just so long as I can block my opponent from winning, then I might end up okay after all. We end up seeing our headquarters phase occur right after Old One-Eye manages to use Farron to rout my tactical squad. One very nice thing is I actually was able to benefit from Taurus, so I was able to trigger that battle ability. I was able to draw 3 cards. I ended up getting a Primal Howl, Iron Guard Recruits, and Indomitable for myself, and then once we move on to the headquarters phase, I end up pulling in 2 cards, a couple Honored Librarians, which are going to be instrumental in fueling my aggressive playstyle, and now I'm at 6 resources, 10 cards, relative to the Tyranid players, 7 resources and 6 cards. Our new 5th planet happens to be Eloith, which is worth 2 cards. It lets you tutor the top 3 cards of your deck. And at the present moment, the initiative token is in my hands. So I'm trying to figure out what exactly do I want to do. Do I want to try to put some attackers into play? Do I want to try to win command? The planet layout is still wide open. I've now full well realized how Blackmane's Hunt actually works, so Planet 2 is going to be a very appealing option for me. I've now got the initiative token, so I know that I can try to press a lot of pressure on my opponent with cards like this Honored Librarian. Either I can attack first, augmented by that Catachan Outpost to take a swing for 6, which is essentially guaranteed to kill his Scything Hormigaunts unless we see a copy of Regeneration, and I was feeling pretty good about that. I suppose if I needed to, I could bounce Ragnar from Planet 2 to Planet 1, and then that would also set up my tactical squad favorably at our planet number 2. We end up seeing our opponent, kwarrend, puts a virulent Spore Sacs into play at planet number 1, and that of course is going to give him a nice little convenient opportunity to infest that planet. Granted, he doesn't have enough resources for anything along the lines like a Shrieking Harpy or anything really frightening like that. He doesn't have a digestion pool in play to really take advantage of infestation, and what's kind of nice is this is going to be the second time that if he triggers that Spore Sacs, that infestation is going to be cleared out at the end of the battle no matter what, just because the planet's either going to be captured or disappear into the void. I go ahead and put a copy of the Blackmane Sentinel at the first planet. That costs me a couple of resources, but I want to try to break even for command at that planet, and then I also just want to kind of make sure that there are some additional bodies on the battlefield. And of course, seeing as how I'm not going to be sending Ragnar to planet number 1, I could just choose at any point to move those Blackmane Sentinels to wherever it is that I end up sending Ragnar. We end up seeing my opponent put out a copy of the Toxic Venomthrope to planet number 5. I believe at this point it's my deploy action. I think I've yet to pass. Kwarrend and I are on Skype while we play this game, and what's going to be my final action here is playing a rogue trader out at planet number 4, because I'm really in desperate need of resources to try and fund effects like getting my Sanctioned Psyker into play to try to win some command, getting that second Honored Librarian out into the battlefield. I don't really have many shield icons in my hand, but I'm relying on those Blackmane's hunts to relocate myself. I've got a copy of Primal Howl, so I could potentially trigger that once again to draw still additional cards, and then I'm kind of relying on that first planet. The Spore Sacks aren't going to be able to do enough damage to kill my Honored Librarian. I'm not exactly sure where the Blazing Zoanthrope is going to go, but I can rest assured that the planet is not going to be infested until after the onset of the combat phase, so the Zoanthrope's reaction has to occur prior to the virulent spore sac infesting the planet, and I've got an adequate number of shield icons in my hand to make sure that I can get off at least one swing, so I'm not really convinced that my opponent is going to be sending their relatively fragile Synapse unit to the first planet just in case I end up attacking it for 6. And of course that Scything Hormigaunt doesn't end up actually becoming a 3/3 until the planet is infested, and of course the only reason it's sitting there unexhausted at the first planet is due to Planum. My opponent's final action, which I definitely was not happy to see, is that he puts out a Tyranid Warrior to planet number 4, and things are looking very frightening for me in regard to a command sense, so I'm even with my opponent at planet number 1, and he's winning 4 and 5. Depending on where exactly our Warlords go, he's going to be able to essentially win whatever that happens to be. So I can't quite recall where my opponent is going to go. For myself, I believe I picked planet number 2 just so I have that decent threat range. I'm not entirely convinced that I would be able to win Taurus, and I really want to be able to back myself up at the first planet if need be. I definitely think there are some pretty reasonable command options for my opponent. He could send his Warlord to planet number 5 to tutor a card to ensure that he gets that 2-card bonus and that the Toxic Venomthrope manages to infest that planet. What's actually kind of interesting that I just forgot up until this moment is that if the command struggle is won by my opponent at planet number 1, he would end up infesting that planet, which would mean that his Blazing Zoanthrope could indeed attack my unit for 2, or rather trigger its reaction for 2. So it looks like Old One-Eye sends his Warlord to number 2. He must have wanted to steal resources from me. He ends up taking 2 points of damage. He does not shield it, thanks to Ragnar's reaction. And then we see, of course, my Ragnar go to planet number 2. I trigger a Primal Howl. I draw 3 additional cards, a promotion, a Blackmane Sentinel, and a Honored Librarian. And then I notice he sent his Blazing Zoanthrope to Farron, I suppose, just to ensure that he can try to kill off my rogue trader there. So even though he was almost guaranteed to be able to win command, I guess he's just going to try to choke me as much as possible in a resource sense, so that I wouldn't be able to fund any kind of events like Drop Pod Assault or Eager Recruit or any kind of nasty stuff like that, just because I suppose in going to planet number 2, that's a 2-resource planet. In making sure that my rogue trader gets shut down at planet number 4, which is also a 2-resource planet, we see a pretty significant command victory for my opponent here. I don't believe I actually won command on any planet whatsoever, much to his chagrin, I'm sure. I ended up managing to play that Primal Howl, but he ended up reeling in 2 cards, 2 resources. His Toxic Venomthrope manages, of course, to infest planet number 5, and that's going to set him up favorably to start drawing in additional cards or resources, so long as it can sit there at that now infested planet. As we move into combat, that Blazing Zoanthrope, of course, obliterates my rogue trader. I don't decide to shield it, and as we move into combat on the first planet, he triggers his Virulent Spore Sacs. He ends up dealing out damage, 1 to each of my units, and I go ahead and allow the damage to go through on the Blackmane Sentinel, but I choose to leave my Honored Librarian entirely hale through discarding one of my copies of Blackmane's Hunt. And even though I've yet to win any battles, I'm starting to hopefully feel relatively secure in regard to my ability to potentially win these next few planets. So I'm just trying to think, I've got to try to save as many of these librarians as I possibly can. I've got to try to keep all of my units alive to draw fire away from the librarians. So I'm able to augment my librarian to an attack of 6. I'm able to kill his Scything Hormigaunt with attached Noxious Flesh Borer in a single swing, and then that means I'm going to end up winning the planet and capturing that planet. Something that really works to my advantage during this game is that even though he's got that Awakening Cavern out, the Tyranids don't really have any kind of mid-combat means to alter the attack capability of any of their units. There's no Tyranid Drop Pod Assault, there's no Tyranid Battle Cry or Empower or anything like that. We end up seeing a battle take place at planet number 2. Ragnar, who has the initiative token, takes a swing at Old One-Eye. He's currently got 2 points of damage. We see a Spore Burst discarded by my opponent, so that ends up blocking that damage. My Tactical Squad Cardenas is at present still exhausted, and now we see my opponent's Old One-Eye exhaust in order to take a swing, and he targets my rather vulnerable Tactical Squad Cardenas. Old One-Eye is definitely not playing a very high unit count, weak unit deck. He's not attacking me with swarms like the Swarm Lord would, but definitely the Tactical Squad is a little bit squishier and easier target than is Ragnar. He uses his Awakening Cavern to ready Old One-Eye. He ends up triggering its reaction to remove 1 point of damage, and he ends up finishing off my Tactical Squad Cardenas. And at this point, I've got quite a few cards in hand. I've got no resources but 8 cards, so it works out favorably for him in that I can't Eager Recruit or Drop Pod Assault and really punish him for attacking with Old One-Eye, for having the audacity of exhausting himself, but my opponent only happens to have 2 resources and 4 cards, and there's not really anything too tremendously frightening I could expect from him apart from the likes of a 1-cost signature event, Ferocious Strength, that would give him Brutal, but I was very much willing to press the attack and just really try to deprive each and every shield icon from his hand, just because he didn't have nearly as many cards as I did, and he'd already used his regeneration for the turn to get rid of 1 point of damage instead of something like, 2 or 3, but he ends up retreating, and that means that I'm able to trigger the battle ability of Ossus 4. I end up stealing 1 resource from him. We see that our new planet number 5 is Barlas, which has a battle ability that allows you to discard a card, and of course it itself happens to have a 2-card bonus. We each end up generating 4 additional resource tokens. We each draw 2 additional cards. At the moment, I'm sitting at 5 resources, 10 cards. He has the initiative token, 5 resources, and 6 cards. So even though he's been doing quite a bit better than I have in command, and note that he's certainly much better set up in regard to having a Tyranid Warrior and a Toxic Venomthrope at planets 3 and 4, I'm nevertheless sitting here with a handful of very formidable units. I've got a Blackmane Sentinel, 2 Honored Librarians, an Iron Guard Recruit, and a Sanctioned Psyker if I want to go the command route, and of course I have that promotion as well. I also happen to have 2 Eager Recruits, which are going to be absolutely crucial in making sure that any of the Honored Librarians I put into play are going to be able to stay alive as long as possible. We see yet another copy of the Virulent Spore Sacs. I believe this is his 2nd copy played out to the 1st planet, and that's kind of frustrating for me, in that if I end up sending any of my units there, they're going to take that effectively area effect equivalent 1 volley, and that would kill off my Sentinel if I don't shield it. Of course, Indomitable can't prevent damage like that. I could use it as a shield. I don't really want to use Blackmane's Hunt, but something that's really cool at this point is I can basically just send Ragnar to Taurus. If I have fewer units, I can generate additional resources, I can reel in additional cards, and then if I need to Blackmane's Hunt him over to planet number 1, that's fantastic. If I don't need to, then I can try to just win a battle at that planet conventionally, and then just use Blackmane's Hunt for shields. So at the present moment, I have 1 red, 1 green, and 1 blue icon. My opponent has 1 green and 1 blue, so the game could very well be decided within the next couple of planets. I end up putting out a copy of Blackmane Sentinel to planet number 1, just because I want my opponent to have to do something at that planet. I could easily kill his Virulent Spore Sacs with absolutely no thought whatsoever, or if he blows up his Virulent Spore Sacs, my Blackmane Sentinel survives, and then I end up winning the battle at that planet. So it just puts a little bit more pressure on him. He ends up putting another copy of the Virulent Spore Sacs out to planet number 2, and that's fairly frustrating for me, just because now I'm faced with, I can't easily, work around the explosion and planetary infestation that those units cause. I decide to deprive him of card bonus where possible, just because I do have that working in my favor, and I end up putting out my copy of Sanctioned Psyker at Elowith, planet number 4. He unfortunately happens to answer my Psyker with a promotion, and I answer his promotion with a promotion of my own, so we're once again blocked, but I'm very fine with blocking him, because that means he's either not going to be getting 3 cards, or he has to send his Warlord there, which is fine, because it's going to allow me to, in all likelihood, win another battle, or he'll have to send his Synapse unit there, and once again, that's a little bit more pressure off of me, so it's going to be up to him. Does he think that drawing those additional cards are worth sparing me that pressure? So I'm definitely going to be going to planet number 2, knowing that I can bounce to 3 if I have to, but I probably won't, knowing full well that I can bounce to planet 1 if absolutely necessary, or otherwise I can just sit here at Taurus. He only happens to have 6 units compared to my 5. Both of his Virulent Spore Sacs are relatively suicidal, so if I had to bounce over to Farron, I'd be okay with potentially winning a battle there and routing one of his units, but let's ultimately see where he ends up committing his forces. Alright, so at this point, he's finally picked both of his destinations for Synapse unit and Warlord. Of course, I send Ragnar to planet number 2. We see his Warlord touch down on planet number 5, which is going to net him some additional cards. It's going to force me to randomly discard one of the cards I happen to have in my hand, and it seems as though he's potentially fearful of Space Marine events, is at least my thought, just based on how he's trying to choke my resources, trying to get rid of my cards. He's definitely playing a much more economic game than I'm, trying to make the best out of not winning a lot of resources just by trying to be as aggressive as I possibly can. I only win 1 command struggle. I only pull in a paltry 1 card and 1 resource. He ends up managing to win command at 3 different planets, which results in 4 cards and 2 resources. I'm not exactly sure, but I think at this point he may have forgotten to trigger his Toxic Venomthrope in order to generate him an additional card or additional resource. I don't know if that's actually going to play much of a difference in regard to the outcome of this game, but at the present moment, we don't happen to have any command actions, and going into combat, planet number 4 does happen to be infested, so the Blazing Zoanthrope is going to deal out 2 points of damage to his Sanctioned Psyker, and it does seem as though my opponent has forgotten to get the additional bonus afforded to him by the Toxic Venomthrope, so a very small mistake. Hopefully it won't end up playing a crucial difference in regard to the outcome of this game. Now that the reaction at the onset of the combat phase is over, my opponent chooses to essentially bite the bullet and use the combat action of his Virulent Spore Sacs at planet number 1 in order to destroy that unit, deal out 1 point of damage to my Blackmane Sentinel, and just like I wanted it to work, I'm going to end up winning that planet essentially uncontested. So Blackmane Sentinel captures that planet. It's just as good as no longer being infested, and at this point I end up stealing 1 resource from kwarrend. I think he's enough of a gentleman to actually remind me that I've yet to boost up my resource counter, so I believe I do that in just a moment. And of course, there's going to be a battle taking place at Taurus. There I add my resource. So we're presently at 3 resources, 8 cards for myself, 2 resources, 7 cards, so very close for my opponent. In regard to Taurus, taking a look at unit totals, I've presently got 5 units. My opponent happens to have 5 units as well, and of course he destroys his Virulent Spore Sacs. He deals out 1 damage. I allow my Blackmane Sentinel to be destroyed. My Honored Librarian, I believe I discard my now unnecessary copy of Blackmane's Hunt in order to keep it entirely preserved, entirely hale and healthy, just because, like I mentioned earlier, I want to make sure that they remain at as high a hit point value as possible. At this point, I know that my opponent has played all 3 of his copies of Virulent Spore Sacs. There's no other Tyranid area effect option outside of Heavy Venom Cannon, and he doesn't happen to have any elites in play, at least no elite army units in play, so I don't have to worry about that. And of course, he doesn't have anywhere near enough resources to be able to fund an elite plus a Heavy Venom Cannon, so I know that there's not going to be any kind of area effect to worry about. Barlas's battle ability does trigger, and I happen to lose one of my critically important copies of Honored Librarian, but in this game I was fortunate enough to draw each and every copy of my Librarians by only having drawn through 29 different cards in my deck. So at the present moment, all of our Synapse and Warlord units return to HQ. My Honored Librarian is now sitting at our new Planet 1, and now we've only got 4 planets remaining on the table. We see our headquarters phase occur. We each generate 4 additional resources, draw 2 cards. I'm at 7 resources, 8 cards. My opponent is at 6 resources, 9 cards. So even though he's been able to best me in an economic sense, those 2 copies of Primal Howl have been absolutely crucial in fueling my just, number of cards in hand, and I think just my ability to be a little bit better about whether or not it was entirely an accident or not, showing up at the same planet as my opponent's Warlord has ended up working out pretty well for me. I use my action. I happen to be the player with the initiative token, and I end up deploying my second copy, I guess technically my third copy of Honored Librarian at planet number 1, and now we're waiting on our Tyranid player to figure out exactly what it is that he's going to do. Keep in mind, I've got my Catachan outpost ready to augment one of my attackers by 2. Ragnar only happens to have a single point of damage. Old One-Eye also only happens to have a single point of damage, and that Blackmane Sentinel sitting in my headquarters is going to be arriving at the first planet as well. There's no more area effect type damage, so it's going to have to die through an attack in order to make one of my Honored Librarians eligible to be destroyed. And at the present moment, in taking a look at the events and whatnot in my hand, I've got a copy of Indomitable to stomach some sort of large attack. I've got a copy of Frostfang, which I can discard as 3 shields. I've got 2 Eager Recruits, and at the present moment, I'm just trying to figure out how exactly am I going to try to win enough resources through command to play as many units as possible now, yet still be able to afford my Indomitable, my Eager Recruits. So I'm trying to think, do I want to play one of my Iron Guard recruits? Do I want to play one of my Imperial Fist siege forces? My opponent ends up playing a copy of Predation at planet number 3 to spread the infestation to planet number 2, and even though I'm the player with the initiative token, I'm getting very worried at this point that he might have another copy of Predation with which to infest planet number 1, and he happens to have 6 resources, which is that magical number to put a Shrieking Harpy into play, and if he drops off Old One-Eye and a Shrieking Harpy and a Blazing Zoanthrope all at planet number 1, and he happens to have his Awakening Cavern, that's potentially going to make my life extraordinarily difficult. So I'm just trying to figure out, so much time is going through my mind where I'm trying to think, where is he going to send his Zoanthrope? Where is he going to send Old One-Eye? Am I going to be able to be ever so slightly risky to put into play my Iron Guard recruits or my Imperial Fist Siege Force, and which of those 2 units should I do? I've only got 2 command icons at the first planet. It's worth 1 resource, it's worth 1 card, but if my opponent happens to play a unit there, is he going to be able to, best me in a command sense? If I put out one of these army units, am I going to ultimately be deprived of the resource I need to play 2 recruits and an Indomitable, and that is why I ultimately opt to pick this Iron Guard recruits, just because it has one more command icon. It's still a body sitting there. It doesn't hit quite as hard as the Imperial Fists do, but I'm counting on, stomaching an additional attack as opposed to dealing out a tremendous amount. The more combat rounds I go, the better off I can ultimately be, because Old One-Eye only gets one chance to heal, and my Librarians, the more times they attack, the better for me. He ends up putting out a copy of Ripper Swarm to Barlas, which is going to end up allowing him to reel in an additional 2 cards, and at this point I don't think I'm out of it yet, so I'm still terrified that he's going to drop a Predation. I'm still terrified he's going to throw out a Shrieking Harpy, but it remains to be seen in regard to what exactly he's going to do. At this point, I pass, even though there's nothing indicated in our chat log. Remember, we're on Skype, and now it's up to my opponent. How is he going to spend his remaining 6 resources? We end up seeing a copy of the Tyranid Warrior played out to planet number 1, and that's starting to make me ever so slightly nervous, because that, of course, happens to have 2 command icons, and if at any point, presently I'm tied at planet number 3, so the only place where I could potentially win command is going to be planet number 1, and if I don't end up winning that resource, then that's going to be either an Indomitable or an Eager Recruit that I'm not going to be able to afford to play. My opponent does finally pass after playing out a regeneration onto his Tyranid Warrior, and now I can effectively rest assured that he's going to be sending both his Synapse unit and his Warlord to planet number 1. Of course, I send Ragnar Blackmane to planet number 1 as well, and my Blackmane Sentinel arrives exhausted. So something for me to keep in mind is my opponent happens to already have 5 cards in hand. He's about to win a ton of command, and that means I have to look out for a few different events. I have to worry about Dark Cunning. That costs 2. I believe it readies an army unit or a Synapse unit, but it could definitely allow his Tyranid Warrior to hurt me. I don't want to damage Old One-Eye more than I have to, and I want to avoid damaging him first, just because I'm worried about Ferocious Strength giving him Brutal. I'm worried about putting a lot of damage on him, getting him nearly bloodied, and then having him ready and removing a maximal amount of damage, and for that reason I'm trying to kill off this Tyranid Warrior first. So I go ahead and assign the 2 points of damage for committing to the same planet as the enemy Warlord to the Tyranid Warrior. It's currently a 2/6. He ends up discarding a copy of Promotion in order to shield against 1 point of damage, so he only happens to have 5 hit points remaining, but he's still very healthy, and now we're right in the thick of combat. As combat is about to begin, I do manage to successfully generate that additional resource that I needed. I draw a Catachan Outpost, which is doing me absolutely no good whatsoever. My opponent and I do manage to tie at planet number 3, so he doesn't generate cards at that planet. He doesn't get the ability to generate an additional card or resource from his Toxic Venom Throat, but he does end up reeling in 2 cards and 2 resources, and like I said before, I'm still very worried about Ferocious Strength, and his Blazing Zoanthrope targets one of my Honored Librarians. He's a gentleman enough to give me the choice as to which one it would be. The planet is not infested, so it's only a single point of damage, and therefore I do not worry about shielding against it. So I've got Frostfang as shields, I've got 2 Eager Recruits, I've got an Indomitable, I've got 3 resources, which are an adequate number to fuel all those effects. My opponent happens to have 4 resources and 6 cards. I take a really quick glance to see how many cards he's drawn through in his deck, just to give me a rough idea as to whether or not he's drawn a Ferocious Strength, and to give a nice comparison as to how many cards I've drawn through relative to how many he has drawn through. So at the present moment, I'm trying to essentially kill off his Tyranid Warrior, because it's not going to be bolstered by Ferocious Strength, and then once Old One-Eye and the Blazing Zoanthrope are exhausted, I can rest assured that I can put as much damage as I can on those exhausted targets and not have to worry about them getting brutal and then killing me. So my Honored Librarian, thanks to the help of the Catachan Outpost, takes a swing for 6, 6 at the Tyranid Warrior that only had 5 hit points remaining, and we see a copy of Spore Burst discarded to drop that damage down to 4. Ultimately, the Tyranid Warrior is going to take 4 points of damage, which will bring him to 5 total points of damage, and only a single hit point left. At the present moment, for some reason, kwarrend happened to have some kind of like mispress or something like that. He inadvertently overassigns the amount of damage to that Tyranid Warrior, and we see Old One-Eye take cover behind the Blazing Zoanthrope, which is a little bit of a nice foreshadow for one of my attack targets in the very near future. But ultimately, we see that Honored Librarian's attack resolve, and the Tyranid Warrior is still sitting there at 1 hit point. That Blazing Zoanthrope is still a 1/4, and Old One-Eye himself is a 2/5. So, now that my initiative is over with, we see my opponent trigger his copy of Regeneration to peel a couple points of damage off of that Tyranid Warrior, and of course, since this is likely to be a very long and protracted combat, I can rest assured that that's the one and only time that Regeneration is actually going to be able to trigger over the course of this battle, and now he decides to exhaust his Tyranid Warrior. What exactly is he going to attack? He decides to attack my copy of the Iron Guard Recruits. Again, it's definitely not the most dangerous attacker, but it is definitely ready. It would attack for 1, and it's yet another body on the battlefield preventing my Honored Librarians from being attacked, so I'm ultimately going to decide to allow this damage to go through just because I want to save Indomitable to potentially absorb some kind of nasty Ferocious Strength attack, and I want to be able to save Frostfang as well. I'm definitely considering discarding Frostfang at this point, but I figure there's no real reason to use it before I have to. Like, I'd rather use it on an Honored Librarian being attacked than that Iron Guard Recruits. Whether or not it would really make a difference, I don't know. Like I said, the Tyranid faction's strength does not come from a lot of mid-combat surprises, and just in wanting to eliminate his combat units, I choose to take a swing with my Honored Librarian to his Tyranid Warrior. I'm not tremendously concerned about this 1/4 Blazing Zoanthrope because it doesn't happen to be damaged yet. I would have hated to deal it, say, 3 points of damage thanks to his shielding, then to see that Ferocious Strength come out, to have it attack, to have it be readied from Awakening Cavern, and then to have it attack me again. He ends up using that 1 point of attack value to kill off my Blackmane Sentinel, and now it's just Ragnar and Old One-Eye kind of staring one another down. Another thing I was trying to do is to avoid putting damage onto Old One-Eye, just because I want to minimize the effectiveness of his reaction, which pulls half of his damage rounded up off of him. So Ragnar takes this opportunity to take a swing for 2 at the now exhausted Blazing Zoanthrope. Old One-Eye chooses to exhaust, and he picks Ragnar Blackmane as his target. At this point, I go ahead and use an action to put out an Eager Recruit, and as it's my opportunity to take an attack, I try to finish off his Blazing Zoanthrope. He does end up discarding a Noxious Fleshborer as shields, and now I suppose if he was going to use the Ferocious Strength, now would be a decent time if he didn't want to wait until he could use it on his Warlord. He ends up using his Awakening Cavern to ready Old One-Eye, and even though I thought I was being clever by trying to prevent damage by going on Old One-Eye, he ends up being truly clever in deciding not to trigger his reaction when he, could only remove 1 point of damage. So if he ends up being able to remove 3 later on, then it's much more worthwhile. He ends up using the Old One-Eye's attack to destroy my copy of Eager Recruits, and in trying to figure out what exactly I want to do, I was originally going to allow it to be destroyed, but I'm thinking to myself, the more bodies I can keep on the table, the more damage I can ultimately deal out each and every combat round. So I do use that Frostfang. I do take another action window to put another copy of the Eager Recruit into play, and then once again, wanting to avoid that Ferocious Strength, I play that Eager Recruit. I end up killing his Synapse unit during the final battle of the game, so it is destroyed, it is discarded, and now I've got my army of Librarians, Eager Recruits, and Ragnar all facing down Old One-Eye here. So this is the decisive combat right here. We go to the end of the combat round, and Old One-Eye chooses to retreat. So good game, called out. over Skype by my opponent. Very well played game by kwarrend. I very much struggled in an economic sense by playing a hyper-aggressive game. I was nevertheless able to pull a win out of what felt like the seat of my pants. In hindsight, in viewing this video, those Primal Howls definitely allowed me a little bit of a comeback. So I'll just end this video by saying thank you so much for watching. I would very strongly encourage you to leave feedback and constructive criticism regarding my play, regarding what you'd have done differently, if I made any potential errors or play mistakes, or if you have any tips for kwarrend, just what he could have done differently, what he could have done better. He was definitely choking and strangling me to the best of his ability in an economic sense. It didn't feel like I had very many resources to fund quite a few different cards in my hand, but at the same time, he was not fortunate enough to draw a copy of Predation that he was digging for, and he mentioned that over Skype. He happened to be holding on to a Shrieking Harpy, but he never got an opportunity to infest that first planet to potentially exhaust all of my non-elite army present at that planet. So whether or not I'd have been ultimately able to destroy that Harpy, whether it would have made a big difference or not, I'm not sure, but let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd very much appreciate were you to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already. And as always, if you are already subscribed, you're encouraged to share this content, as the more likes, the more subscriptions, the more shares, the more potential YouTubers might stumble across this content, like Conquest, be entertained by this channel, buy into this game, join our community, and send the message to Fantasy Flight Games to continue supporting this game and keep on releasing new expansions for this masterful product. So if you'd like me to spectate and commentate a game of your own, or if you're interested in doing a deck deconstruction or any other kind of video, get in touch with me on Twitter or through Facebook, and if you feel so inclined to help cover some of my file hosting and operating expenses, I'd be both humbled and honored were you to visit my Patreon. But I'll just end this video by saying thank you so much for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.